So welcome back, everyone. So we're now moving to the final portion of today's program and also to the final portion of this 5-day symposium. And this event boldly proposed to bring together some of the greatest minds in law in order to discuss law from very multi and interdisciplinary perspectives. And some of the themes and topics we have talked about, for instance, have been citizenship, corruption, ethics, race discrimination, AI, technology, and many more. And nothing more fitting, we believe, than to end the symposium with an intellectual giant whose writings, thinking, and publications have so deeply touched and impacted so many of the areas that were discussed throughout these 5 days. And this intellectual giant is Professor Sheila Jasanoff. Sheila Jasanoff is the Polsheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. A pioneer in her field, she has authored more than 120 articles and chapters and is the author or editor of more than 15 books, including The Fifth Branch, Science at the Bar, Designs on Nature, and The Ethics of Invention. Her work explores the role of science and technology in the law, politics, and policy of modern democracies. Professor Jasanoff also founded and directs the Science, Technology, and Society program here at Harvard. Her honors include the Guggenheim Fellowship, the University of Ghent Sarton Chair, the, correct me if I pronounce this correctly, the Ehrenkreuz from the government of Austria?
Ehrenkreuz.
Ehrenkreuz, okay. And membership in the Royal Danish Academy. And Professor Jasanoff holds an AB, a JD, and a PhD from Harvard University, and as well as an honorary doctorate from the University of Twente. So she's also a trained attorney. And please help me welcome Professor Sheila Jasanoff. So thank you so much for being with us, Professor Jasanoff, and we'll start with a pressing and timely set of issues that were discussed on Tuesday, and which are race and law. And we know that race matters in the criminal justice system. For example, judges set bail that is 25% higher for black defendants that are for black defendants and for white defendants in similar situations. And judges also impose sentences on black defendants that are 12% longer than sentences imposed on white defendants of a comparable or same crime. And we also have evidence suggesting that rulings like these take place because of deeply ingrained racial biases of which we are not even aware. So we would love to get started if you could help this audience of jurists understand what are biases at a cognitive as well as an individual level, first, and second, how do such biases manifest themselves institutionally in the justice system?
Pedro, thank you very much for asking that question, and I'll get to it in a second, but not before I thank the organizers of this amazing event for the honor of asking me to be on the final panel. It's a little daunting. I was not able to come to earlier sessions, but I did look through the program in detail. And first of all, it made me unhappy, as I always am, at not speaking the language of your wonderful country, because it closes certain kinds of doors. But I have visited Brazil one time and went to a lot of different places and at least have some sense of the wealth, intellectual, natural, and cultural that the country provides. So it's a great honor for me to be here with the group of you. Coming to the question directly, there are a few things that I believe, because of my training, but also role in developing the field of science and technology studies, that deviate a little bit from classic social psychology on biases and heuristics. So first of all, to set the baseline, there's a good deal of research that has been done recently, I mean, within the last 10, 20 years, on the deviation in people's responses from some idealized norm. So if you were given a neutral set of choices and probabilistically did certain kinds of things, is the result of human response the same as what you might get by throwing the dice, or is there a systematic deviation in some directions? So in America, a lot of work has been done on so-called cross-race identification. That is, do you discriminate facial characteristics in as refined a way when you're given people of your race as opposed to when you're given people of a different race? And it turns out systematically in those studies that if you're given facial types of a different race, you are much worse at identifying them. Now, this obviously matters in a legal system like ours, where eyewitness testimony remains something that the Supreme Court has said must play a role in criminal proceedings. And if it turns out systematically that if you're given black potential suspects and asked to identify them from a lineup or from pictures, and you're not able to do that in a very refined way because you happen to be white, or vice versa, but the vice versa situation doesn't typically arise. So, we don't have to worry about that so much. Then it creates a distorting effect. So the notion of biases, of course, presumes two things. One is that there's a neutral territory against which bias can be measured, right? And that is something that is already open to a certain amount of question. But the second thing it assumes is that there's something in the working of the individual mind that creates the bias. And Nobel Prize winning literature suggests that we can further classify these biases into certain stereotypical things, like the human mind remembers more recent events more clearly than it remembers more distant events, and therefore instead of acting like a computer, say, which might give equal weight to data from a span of time, the human mind gives disproportionate weight to the thing that came most recently. The human mind takes exceptional things that it has no familiarity with, and bumps them up in significance compared with things that it recognizes as familiar. So ever since the dawn of the nuclear age, people have tried to find out why citizens are much more terrified of nuclear plant accidents than they are of bike riding accidents, when in fact many more people get killed riding bikes than have got killed from nuclear power plant accidents. And what they have discovered is that if you are familiar with a kind of risk, then you demote its significance in relation to you. Now, all of you may be aware that the favorite study population for academics is undergraduates. So the guinea pig in social psychology, the typical guinea pig is an undergraduate, 18 to 22 years old, leading a certain kind of lifestyle. And so it's not surprising that that study population over and over shows that they don't think, for instance, that contraceptives are very dangerous. They don't think bike riding is very dangerous. They don't think car accidents are very dangerous. And yet, statistically, obviously, these car accidents, for instance, are taking between 30 and 40,000 lives every year in the US. It goes up and down a bit. So from that, people have concluded that there is such a thing as a biased brain, and the whole study of heuristics and biases then goes into systematizing what these biases are. Now, I don't want to minimize the fact that a brain, a human being confronted with a choice, may have these biases. The thing that I want to question is that this is a property of the brain, and that it's a property of the individual. Because, of course, we're not all born knowing that bikes are dangerous or not dangerous, right? I mean, you have to be taught something. Moreover, we're not born believing that one race is better or worse or more criminally disposed or less criminally disposed. So those ideas are coming from social structures. And I think that the ingenuity we have invented to look into the operations of the individual mind, especially with newer techniques of imaging, have caused us to focus disproportionately on the way individuals behave and less on the way in which social structures themselves feed certain kinds of biases. So I would say that, of course, these biases are significant, but in the search for how to correct for these biases, we need to look not just at educating the individual out of certain biases, but how these biases come to be pervasive in a social and cultural system in the first place. And that, I think, is harder to do. It requires institutions to be more self-reflexive. It's easier to stick electrodes onto somebody's head and see what's happening in their brain than to look at, say, Harvard University and say, how are we teaching bad thinking? So, you know, that to me is part of the challenge of education and part of the challenge of politics when dealing with this matter of biases.
Very interesting, Professor Jocelyn, especially this interplay between the individual and the environment and what starts what. We can talk now about, we had a few panels talking about artificial intelligence, and today we talked about big data as well. So we'd love to get your thoughts on how these biases manifest themselves into the algorithms that we build. And we have courts in the US have recently started using such algorithms to assess defendants' risk, which, open quote, ranges from the probability that an individual will commit another crime to the likelihood that a defendant will appear for his or her court date. And these algorithmic outputs inform decisions about bail, sentencing, and parole. So one issue is that the government doesn't write this code. The government buys this code from private companies. The code is proprietary, it's secret, no one knows how it arrives at the decisions that it does. And one example, because of a high-risk score in one such system, a defendant named Eric Loomis was given a longer sentence than he otherwise would have had. And just as a background, and would love to get your thoughts on how these biases we've been talking about are codified into algorithms in general, and what are the warnings that you would give jurists as well as technologists as they go about both creating as well as adopting these algorithms to make these judicial decisions?
It's a very complicated set of questions, and of course it's not going to die away. It's going to get, if anything, worse. So I think the first thing I want to say is that this is a problem that has surfaced in the legal system in connection with things like sentencing decisions, where you're getting either mistakes or discrepant results because of biases built into proprietary algorithms. But the problem is far more widespread. So one of the areas that I work in is environmental governance, and in the neoliberal era that we're in, a great deal of outsourcing is done because the federal government does not have the competence, the up-to-date capability to generate the software that it needs to carry out its decisions by itself. So throughout the federal government, an enormous amount of modeling, an enormous amount of computerized decision-making software and capabilities are actually being handled outside of government through outsourcing, and all that outsourcing immediately raises questions about proprietary information. One of the little heuristic things I do with my classes sometimes in the Kennedy School is that I say to them, you know, you cross the intersection, we have Elliott Street and JFK Street, to come into the Kennedy School. How many of you have noticed with these new countdown traffic lights, you know, how many seconds you have to cross? I mean, interestingly, not a single one of them ever in my experimental system has ever noticed, okay? I have, because I'm an STS scholar, and I notice these things, and there didn't used to be a traffic light at all, so when the traffic light came, of course I was interested, and it's 19 seconds. So where did they get the 19 seconds from? So my first run, how many of you have noticed? No, no one has noticed. I say, well, it's 19 seconds. Where do you think the 19 seconds came from? Now, I mean, you know, you could do an entire unpacking there, because I can guarantee you City Hall in Cambridge did not come up with the 19 seconds. I actually, as a quite aware citizen of Cambridge, have no idea who they outsourced it to. But if I say to people, what would it take to make you question the 19 seconds, they all have an answer to that. A fatal accident at that intersection, right? So, you know, one thing that I point out from this is that modernity is a very complicated place. We need simplifications. We need ways of reaching decisions so that we're not sitting there paralyzed all the time. And nobody has the time, energy, skills to go back behind every one of these packaged technical decision-making systems to say, well, where did the biases creep in, and so forth. What we need to think of instead is, what is the system of trust that you would need such that if it malfunctions, if there's the equivalent of that fatal accident, and your Loomis case is like an example of that, then what would you need in order to, you know, deal with that problem as it arises? And one thing that everybody would say back in a democracy is you need transparency. Our legal system in America is built on much more liberal discovery rules than most legal systems. And yet, those discovery rules bump up against proprietary claims. They are not allowed to cross over. Well, I think that is an area of reform in the law that we need to think about carefully. If software is going to take away liberty, then saying that you cannot confront the software is like saying you're being denied a Fifth Amendment right. It could be being denied a Fourth Amendment right in this country. So, you know, you have to think in terms of your own legal system and in terms of the constitutional guarantees. But we can't say, because it's mathematics, and hence, you know, divinely universal, we can't get behind it. It's not mathematics. Somebody programmed it. Somebody's ideas got in there. And you ought to be able to question, you know, what those presumptions were. And in terms of jury instructions, if you're not able to do that, then the jury should be told about that and should be told, you know, I mean, after all, we do have Daubert in this country. So if an algorithm is presented as evidence, then the error rates should be there. If that's not being tested for, then the testimony should be discounted. So to some extent, the legal system, any legal system, probably already has hooks with which to get behind these things. The psychic problem is that we are so inclined to say, oh, machines are fail-safe, mathematics is universal, algorithms are beyond our poor powers to understand, that this aura of respectability steps in along with that kind of evidence. And I think that, you know, what I think we need to teach the citizens of the 21st century is that our machines are every bit as fallible as we are, and computers, you know, equally so. And so where do you get at them? Not that you need to do this every moment with everything, but if you need to, can you get behind it? And if there are closed doors with bolts on them that you can't get behind, that is a system of injustice. The same way that some president's tax returns not being available is a moment of injustice.
Yeah, thank you so much, especially as we have judges in the audience who are interested in adopting some of these technologies in Brazil. So that's very illuminating. Let's turn to the future of the legal profession. I think that's something they're very interested in. What are the jobs within law that you think are the most at risk of automation? And how do you think that lawyers in the legal profession in general can best prepare today for such future?
You know, I look at 2008 and I look at the drop in the number of law school applications and think that something that bursts the bubble of our sometimes over-optimistic and heated financial systems may have more impact than all of the mechanization put together. But anyway, people are interested in mechanization. Well, this is a very general point. An awful lot of what we do in modern societies is, in some sense, drudge work, and that is where computerized systems can do well. I mean, so do you need the trained lawyer's time to look through thousands and thousands of pages of documentation to pick out the collocation of words and phrases that are indicative of something being the matter. That kind of search function of a huge database for a particular set of things is one of the places where one can economize and get efficiency by replacing human work. But even then, I don't think that's right. I mean, I work with people who do quantified data analysis, discourse analysis, to try to identify linguistic trends. And an awful lot of judgment comes into play even there. But nevertheless, I think that by and large, the generic type of problem where the legal profession may save time and money, and where lawyer time may be most at risk, is problems that meet this generic set of criteria. Identical type activities, very clear input signals, what are you looking for, and then, you know, a lot of drudgery to go through a great deal of documentation. I don't think that, you know, so there are some studies that show that across numbers of cases, if you feed the inputs into the computer does no worse than the average judge judging those kinds of cases. For instance, in this country, for a lot of the 1990s in particular, beginning in the mid-1980s, the lower courts were caught up with asbestos litigation. Asbestos became a huge occupational health problem. It was allowed to blow into a problem bigger than it might have been because industry concealed data and many, many people got sick. Now, most of those cases were settled, but not before they had tied up judicial time. Another very prevalent, widespread type of case is anything to do with motor vehicle accidents, and you have to pay, you know, I mean, some compensation changes hands. So if you have, again, these types of cases that are very generic, very frequent, consume a great deal of judicial time, and in any case are getting settled, almost in a formulaic way, maybe there you can have, you know, some computerized process where you say, if your case has the following types of indicators, then we get, you know, that outcome out of there. But that's essentially like creating a no-fault system, right? And we've done that in this country after devastating events. And we have a human computer who does that. His name is Kenneth Feinberg. How many of you have ever heard of this man? So he is the man who crafted the settlement after 9/11, but before that he had crafted settlements in the Vietnam veterans lawsuit on napalm. He's the one who was called after the Boston Marathon. He's the one who was called by GM when they had the General Motors ignition switch accident. I mean, so he is this one-man industry who goes around settling these cases, and he comes up with rules. Like after the Boston Marathon, he said, if you didn't spend any nights in the hospital, but you have a treatable, clinically diagnosed condition, you get this much money. If you spent a night in the hospital, you get this much money. If you spent 2 nights in the hospital, you get this much money. Well, a computer could have done that too, right? We just humanize it. So, but that's an example of what can be entrusted to the machine. What cannot be entrusted to the machine is changing ideas of justice. I mean, you know, these days in America, you have to think about sexual harassment. And we know who spearheaded making that an offense in the first place. A computer could not have done that. A computer would have taken maybe the average treatment of women and used that as the baseline and said, well, this is the norm, so why deviate from it? So to the extent that we, as progressive thinkers, as people caught up in the talons of modernity, you know, with a lot of standardization, think that the standard is wrong. I mean, I am a child of the Indian independence movement. My parents were involved in the Indian independence movement. So to some extent, I still see the world as in need of a lot of reform. And machines are not going to reform us. Machines are status quo. We program them. And it's well to remember that when we're thinking about futures, reform, change, justice. We're not in an equal world.
for us just enough. We have just a follow-up on that. We have this incredibly large population of attorneys in Brazil. And one of the reasons being is because you don't have to have a bachelor's degree in order to go into law, but law is the bachelor's degree in itself. So the market seems to be incredibly saturated there. And one assumption that might be problematic when we talk about machines and when we talk about the jobs that will exist and will not exist, I think is the assumption that everyone is able to do the work that is more creative, like the idea of justice, for instance. And what do you say to that? Like, do we all have this capability, you find, of engaging in this more abstract level thinking? And is there like migration that will necessarily happen? Or do you think there'll be job displacement across sectors? Attorneys would find that they just can't be in law and they'll do something else, for instance.
I mean, again, that's a kind of question that could keep us here forever. And since this is the concluding session, I think a hope is that it will, in a sense, keep you here forever, but not by sitting imprisoned in your chairs in this room, but that you'll carry away ideas that will stay with you forever. So, I think, again, this is a whole sort of challenge for societies of the future. We are ingenious. I mean, I have in my family files a letter written to my grandmother by my great-uncle, who was the youngest brother of my grandfather, and he was studying here in America. The letter is written from Oxford Street, which is one of the streets up there near the campus. And he's writing to this sister-in-law that he's never met, congratulating her on the marriage and talking about how amazing it is to him that people don't have to sweep because they have vacuum cleaners. And I mean, so he's writing to this unknown woman about, the differences in domestic activity. But, I also have a distinguished historian colleague at the University of Pennsylvania who wrote an entire, quite influential book a number of years ago called More Work for Mother. And what she did was trace the impact of these domestic technologies on what actually happened to women's work, and discovered, the expectations of what women were now responsible for changed alongside their work. So, standards of cleanliness became such that you had to push that vacuum cleaner more than you might have had to sweep before. So technological change is a very complicated thing. How it intersects with behavior is a very complicated thing, and we have to think about that. Now, it is quite possible. I mean, the very specific question you're asking is, does everybody have the same level of creativity that they can engage in these path-breaking jumps? Well, obviously not. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have the differentiation we have in creativity across, all of the different sectors. It's not just legal creativity, it's writing fiction, making movies, doing dance. I mean, you're a country where that is a pretty important form of creativity. So not everybody has that, but in the educational system, which many of you are committed to, we don't act as if we know the limits of your creativity ahead of time. We try to create a substrate in which people are given the opportunities. And shutting off those opportunities is what worries me. I mean, so creating a mechanized environment in which we already know ahead of time. This is something, educational systems that have experimented with like the 12+ exam that many countries did, that already by the age of 12, we know whether you're going to be a drudge in society or a thinker in society, and so we channel you that way. I mean, those have not turned out to be extremely successful. I would much rather see experimentation with hours of work and flex time and, all of these other kinds of innovations, which also are happening, of course. And I would also like to think about what resources we give to people to do the things, to use their time. I stopped watching television many, many, many years ago, and I'm appalled whenever I have to watch television. But if you look at the way people spend their time, it's I mean, it's like that is already mechanized, but nobody's talking about that. I mean, nobody's talking about the way in which the average 6 hours or whatever an average American spends in front of the television screen affects their creativity and their mental flexibility and their ability to vote as thoughtful citizens of a society. I mean, so I think that we need a kind of, the term in my field is reflexive. Think back on yourself. I mean, what is it that you're doing or not doing as a society? So it's a problem that I think transcends the law. It's about being in this era of rapid change in which we have enormous capabilities, but I don't think that we're tending to the question of, what is a thoughtful human being supposed to do with these resources that we're opening up? Instead, I think we're, to some extent, imagining people as just being deficient machines. And I hate to say this, I don't think we are deficient machines. I think machines are deficient humans.
Thank you, Professor Jasanoff. So that's a nice segue. We have 2 concluding questions, and the first one of which is, what are the big changes that our society will have to deal with, and how we can be better prepared to address them?
Yes, well, one of the things that I'm hoping to work on at the Kennedy School, which is, after all, a premier school of public policy, is how we deal with the challenges of globalization in a way different from the one that we seem to have embraced right at the moment, that is fear and a retreat to national boundaries. So how do we deal with the more mobile, more mixed up, more, producing more encounters that people are unhappy with for some reason? How do we recognize that there is a world to be governed and take our place in it? For the law, that includes technical things like trans-border conflicts that have to do, for instance, with environment. But for instance, just the other day, I was visited by somebody from the UN who's dealing with the Security Council resolution on returned foreign fighters. And the kinds of security threats they pose. I mean, so France, for instance, knows that there are X many French people who are fighting in Syria now, but they might come back, and they might have more Bataclan type of events happening. So, there's a whole set of challenges that comes about from being mobile, from having more mixed up identities. And of course, society is stratified. That is, some people are mobile and some people are not. And therefore, the conflicts between the ones who are sedentary and the ones who are mobile, that is rising. And we see that in the rising nationalisms, whether it's Hungary or Turkey or Russia or the United States. I mean, we see those sorts of problems. And I think that those coupled with youth unemployment, because we're not training people to be in the world of Silicon Valley and tomorrow. I think that those are flashpoints. I mean, those are really, sort of revolutionary moments, and something has to be done. I would side certainly with the people who think that the level of inequality in the world is unsustainable. I mean, the numbers, I mean, they're hard to grasp. I mean, if 5 people in the world own as much wealth as half the bottom earning people in the world, I mean, what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean that we've allowed this world to come into being, and what are we going to do about that? And I think that all of us have to sort of say, where do I stand and what can I do in relation to it? I do think that one of the things in the present era that people have suggested is, whatever your level of activity was politically, go one notch more. If you only used to give money, then call. If you only used to call, then write. If you only used to write, then make a public appearance. I mean, that sort of thing. So I think that living in the 21st century calls on all of us as citizens to recognize that we're citizens on one more level than we were before. I mean, so we're local citizens, we're professional citizens, we are citizens of a city, a region, a nation, but we're also citizens of the world. I happen to be an an early import into that citizen of the world category. But I think we all are now. So I welcome you to this strange territory. And I think to inhabit that is one of the greatest challenges of now.
Thank you so much. So we have one last question, after which we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. So you feel free to step up to one of these microphones for a few minutes. And so we'll close on a positive note. And in the Brazilian flag, you find the saying, order and progress. And the theme of the event is institutions drive progress, the affirmation that they do. And I guess we would love to end this symposium with your thoughts on how can, in fact, institutions drive progress.
Ah, yes, institutions. Many people in my field, science and technology studies, tell me, you know, oh, Sheila, your work is unique because you look at institutions. And I think to myself, you know, what a strange thing to say. But it is a fact that people often think just of individuals and then to some degree of nations and forget the role of institutions like the one that you're seated in. I think educational institutions have an enormous role to play. I mean, we shape minds, we shape people's ideas of how, I mean, even what progress is. I mean, what is progress? A lot of scientists think that anything you can do is progress in the sciences. So if you can go in and edit the human genome, that is progress by definition. But, you know, there are lots of reasons to think that that's a simplistic account of progress. So I think we can get, I mean, I think institutions have an enormous role in articulating norms, ideas that transcend the individual, the sorts of value goals a society lives with and lives by. I think institutions educate people to inhabit those norms in some sense. I think institutions perpetuate, they provide historical continuity, hopefully not in a rigid way, but in ways that allow you constantly to memorialize, to think what was the past and what is our relationship to it and what will the future be. So, you know, sometimes it leads to slightly absurd results. I mean, like the law school at Harvard currently does not have a seal because last year or the year before there was agitation about the potentially racist and slavery associations of the existing Harvard Law School seal. Well, whatever you think of the outcome, it was a moment of reflection. It was thinking, how does our past relate to our present and relate to the future? And I think institutions, almost by definition, are the places where we do that kind of reflection. And there can't be progress unless that train of thought is something that we enable. This is, you know, you can do it while you're chopping onions in your kitchen, but an institution, well, of course, you're engaging in the institution of cooking, but, you know, where you can actually talk to other people and exchange ideas inside of institutions, that is where you can hope to effectuate new norms for the future and, you know, and rethink old norms. In this country, and this is the last thing I'll say, we pride ourselves on this famous constitution that's supposed to be so short and yet such a work of genius that it survived, you know, all these hundreds of years. I say, yeah, it was a work of genius that I could not have voted in. And yet there are ideas in there that deserve to be perpetuated. So we need to think critically of what it was that a document like that, an institution, constitutional law, nailed down that we want to rethink and keep perpetuating and renewing, and what it foreclosed as well, that we do not want to perpetuate. And the institutional space is one in which that kind of collective thinking is possible on all of the dimensions of our collective existence.
Thanks, Professor Jasanoff. I was just told that I'm supposed to ask one more question. And you're right that, open quote, forward trajectories in science, technology, and local initiative look like causes for optimism, but they do not necessarily bode well for peace and cooperation in the transition to a more sustainable world. So in light of a previous panel that we just had on the topic of political protests, what does this mean for mobilization towards a more equitable world?
Yeah, so, I guess I see the time we're in as a time for mobilization. I don't consider myself a movement person. I mean, probably a little too against the grain in the ways I think that, but nevertheless, I think it ties totally to your point about institutions. That is, if the institutions of the existing world appear to have failed us in certain important respects, then mobilization may be necessary to recreate institutions. When something called the Environmental Protection Agency has become something like the Self-Promotion Agency, then it's time to think, Earth Day is today. So what can we do to say what we think about the Earth? It happened X many decades ago, but maybe there is a renewal necessary, and maybe it should not be at the national level, but ought to be done in some other set of ways. I think really this is, you were asking about creativity in the mechanized future, but this question of what is the kind of world we want and what is the kind of world we want to leave behind, that may require mobilization in ways that we didn't even perceive. And, it's something that I'm thinking through with my own students, recognizing, some of you may be amused to know that my most popular article has the title Technologies of Humility. And one person, a friend of mine sent me an article from Oxford saying, Harvard professor advocates humility, so any prescriptions I have, though, are in a spirit of humility. That they're founded in a recognition of what I personally can do and how little it is compared with the needs of the world. But I do think, again, based on my historical memory of things like Indian independence, that the collectivity is able to do more, and mobilization really is about drawing out the better instincts, the better angels of our nature, to take a phrase, and demonstrate those, make them public. So I do think there is space for mobilization.
Thank you so much. So we move to the question and answer portion. Yeah? Oh, you have a question. Okay, so sorry. So I don't know, should we look at the app or should we do live? The microphones? So if you want to just step up to the microphone if you have a question. So we have 2 microphones, one on each side of the room. Step up to the microphone if you have a question.
Professor Sheila, talking about judgment biases, what do you think is more accountable, algorithms or the judge's mind?
You know that any trained lawyer will say it depends. I know a lot of very interesting decisions that have been handed down by judges. I also know, how few decisions really conform to the case method that we're taught in law schools, where you're given a very difficult case and you walk through the reasoning and so forth. As you know, no doubt, more than 95% of all civil litigation, probably more than 98% at the moment, they get settled. So in doing a settlement, it's possible that the kinds of data inputs that you need to come up with a fair settlement might well be fed into a machine, and there's no guarantee that a judge would do it better. In terms of criminal sentencing, a lot of different inputs that are about characteristic features of the case might produce a better averaged out answer. Probably certain kinds of things that we statistically know to be aberrations, like the death penalty is handed out more when it's a black on white crime than when it's a white on white crime, okay? There's no reason for such a discrepancy. And, you could imagine a system in which the judge should not be making that decision. The computer should be making that decision. However, the computer's workings are only as good as our societal biases at any given moment. And we make scribal errors, and we make all kinds of other errors of things we fail to count that are important. I mean, like, who knows whether the right indicators went into this. There are also other concerns of a legal system, like mercy. And one knows that the machine is neither forgetful nor merciful. So, you know, those kinds of questions. Should somebody at the age of 16 be tried as a juvenile or an adult if the adult age cutoff is 18? I mean, you know, is the machine going to tell us that? Even if it averages it out. I mean, maybe one of the things you want to consider in such a decision is family history, and maybe there are very particularities there. So, you know, this is why I say it depends. And I think that in many areas of the law where you're looking at evidence, you say this is just one input. And you can instruct the jury, take this as one input. A good judge says, you know, there's eyewitness testimony, but here are reasons to doubt the credibility of eyewitness testimony. It's not kept away from the jury, but it's given to the jury with caveats. I think, in a way, mechanical information, mechanical judgment systems need to be operated in that same sort of way, with you know, a space for intuitive override.
We're not checking the app, so if you have asked a question through the app, please feel free to step up to the microphone. Maybe we have time for 2 more, Isa, or perhaps 1 more? Okay, so we have time for 1 more question, and we welcome your question.
So I'm making a linguistic question. We've been thrilled by your presentation, and we covered so many different topics. And I wanted to ask you, if you had to recommend one or a small set of books, which ones would them be?
Books recommended for whom and to whom? Recommendations for this audience on... That's a very tall order. I mean, I can tell you books that have influenced me. You know, so one book that has influenced me greatly is a book called Imagined Communities by a political scientist who was at one time a colleague of mine at Cornell, but who recently died, Benedict Anderson. And the reason that that book was influential for me is that it pointed out that classifications we take for granted in the world are acts of imagination. He pointed out that a nation is a nation because we imagine ourselves to be part of it. A statistician might come along and take measurements of, you know, a segment of the population in Brazil and a segment of the population in America and find that they're identical. And yet the self-identification is a different thing. So that idea has proved to be quite important for me. And this is not a recommendation, but this is just a statement of fact that one of my recent edited volumes called Dreamscapes of Modernity has turned out to be very gripping for a lot of readers around the world, but especially, you know, 50 minus in age, maybe 40 minus, because it points out that many of the ways in which we imagine progress are to some extent visions. And it's a book, and it's an edited volume, and it talks about the ways in which people's visions have been articulated into reality. So one of the articles that I like in there is the way in which the founder of the Indonesian internet imagined questions of access to the internet and his political philosophy of what he thought the internet ought to be doing, and how the design of the Indonesian internet reflected these political beliefs. So I think that book, Dreamscapes of Modernity, has a series of articles in it. They're not specifically connected to law, though some are, but they're about the question of how we as citizens of modernity imagine futures in which certain kinds of realities come about, in part because we've imagined them, used institutional resources, the progressive feel of institutions to do something with and about them. And then, of course, one could name, warhorse type things. I mean, like Piketty's book on inequality has become, an economic classic, and people should at least know what a book like that says, even if they don't read this massive, massive work. So I think there are, a number of such sort of critical perspectives on the ways in which we've organized ourselves. And I think rather than recommend names of any more books, I would say that people should go out and make an effort to read at least something that tries to render our world and the condition it's in strange in some way, that forces us to ask, why this, why now, why like this? Because I think that that's the entry point into thinking, how could it be different?
Thank you, Professor Jasanoff. Fascinating. In time for more questions, or we're out of time? Out of time, unfortunately. I want to thank you for, yeah? Okay, we have time for one more. One last question is yours.
Can I address the question for here?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Professor, to which extension will we exercise our lives with free will in the next years? To which extension our lives will be guided by wills or willingness that we don't know that we are feeling, but from external stimulus and external acts? My life will be driven without my free will. To which extension can I control my free will in the next years, considering the influence of artificial intelligence?
So, of course, you know that you're asking a question that has troubled religious thinkers from time immemorial. And, it's interesting that free will and determinism should be reinvented in a secular world as if we're thinking about it for the first time. I can only tell you what I believe. I believe that the will is never free in that sense. I mean, that is from very early on, we're conditioned by a whole lot of things: genetics, evolution, social, cultural context. Our parents or whoever brought us up have an enormous amount to do with how much so-called freedom we have or don't have. So I think that the question more appropriately might be, what new influences are there we don't control what our parents did to us anyway. So the uncontrollable dimension is not in itself new. The question that might be new is if we're surrounded by all these very sophisticated mechanical systems that are thinking ahead of us in some sense, what room for maneuver do we have there? I think it's what kind of morality are we teaching? I do not think that we're anywhere near to an era in which human thought is being swamped out or is in danger of being swamped out. And I think that in terms of questions like interpersonal responsibility, in terms of what kind of role do you want to adopt in your society, how active do you want to be, just endless choices. I see absolutely no likelihood that these are going to be swamped out by this, sort of the emerging singularity or transhumanism or whatever. Moreover, I also don't think that we have no choice in this future that we're bringing about. I think that the greatest constraint on free will is probably fatalism, that we put our hands in our lap and say, oh, I can't do anything about it. We don't understand the human brain. I'll tell you a little secret. My son is a neuroscientist, and of course, I didn't put in plugs for family books, but it so happens that within the last 12 months, my daughter's written a book and my son has written a book. I won't put in plugs for them, but their name is Jasanoff, so you can look it up. Latin America figures in my daughter's book. So, you know, but my son's book is about the brain. And, you know, one of the things that I think a neuroscientist finds is that there are enormous mysteries and that the brain is dependent on its surroundings, which include other people and how you interact. So I don't think the moment of moral choice is being taken away from us, not any more than we already somehow believe that it is being taken away from us. So I'm not particularly worried about that. I am worried about a society in which somehow we stop thinking about what ideas like human dignity or integrity or community, what these things are about. I recently submitted a paper to a journal, and it got back a horrendous review from the scientist. It was a co-authored paper, as it happens, with multiple authors, but it was sent back by a scientist who said, these social scientists want us to use their language, and by framing their paper in the language of social science, using vague words like human dignity, you know, they are you know, showing contempt for the language of science. I mean, you know, I just found this a sort of staggering response. But, you know, that person, in a way, is saying, oh, you social scientists, me and my colleagues, should not be talking in the language of morality because it's too vague, and, you know, you should instead be talking about biology. But that's an absurd statement. I mean, you know, and, you know, actually that piece got published in a more eminent science journal. So, I mean, you know, the story ends well. Anyway, so I think I would fight this idea, the fatalistic idea that we have no, you know, space for moral intuition. I think all of the evidence at the moment shows, on the contrary, that as we expand our technological universe, there's more scope for us to think with the moral imagination.
Terrific, Professor Jasanoff. I'm looking at the organizers, so do we have time for more questions, or unfortunately we don't? So I'd like to thank you, Professor Jasanoff, for enriching us with your words, presence, and intellect, and please help me thank Professor Jasanoff for joining us. Thank you so much once again, and I just want to offer a word or two about the organizers. Just one thing really quickly. And putting together an event is really hard. Putting together an event of this caliber is even harder. And for context, we've had 24 panels, 56 speakers, 5 days of panels, keynotes, and workshops. We've had about 40 or so federal judges, 1 Supreme Court justice, the Prosecutor General, and several scholars and jurors from Brazil in the Symposium, as well as some of the world's leading scholars in law from Columbia, Harvard, University of Chicago, as attending as well as contributing to the event. And none of this would have been possible without the genius and boldness of 4 people. I'd like to mention them specifically. A lot of people, but I'd like to call them to the stage. Isabella, Eric, Bruno, and Professor Aline Osorio as well. Take it away. Thank you.
Prezados, I'm switching to Portuguese now, so prezados, gostaríamos de agradecer imensamente a presença de cada um de vocês. Não foi nada fácil organizar esse evento, foram meses intensos de preparação, de correr atrás de material, casar a agenda de todo mundo que veio falar aqui, inclusive a agenda de vocês também para se prepararem, né, para fazer uma viagem, para participar de um evento longo e intenso como esse. Então, eu gostaria de pedir uma salva de palmas para todos nós, do esforço de todo mundo, de ter tomado, né, seu tempo para vir até aqui aprender um conhecimento de ponta que colocou lado a lado grandes profissionais e professores brasileiros com grandes professores americanos e esse intercâmbio maravilhoso que nós tivemos. Então, salva de palmas para todos nós. E não poderemos deixar de agradecer aos nossos patrocinadores, né, que permitiram que esse evento fosse possível, organizado pela Associação de Estudos Brasileiros da Harvard Law School, no qual a gente cumprimenta a pessoa da nossa presidente, Aline Osório, e também com apoio da Juferges, na pessoa de quem agradecemos o juiz federal Fabrício, e também do David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, da Harvard University. Não sei, temos algum representante aqui? Acho que não. Agradecemos o apoio institucional, também dos juízes federais, também já agradeceu o Fabrício, mas dos estaduais também, que estão presentes aqui, na pessoa da doutora Renata Gil, que nos apoiou com a Maerge, Instituto Alana, Dr. Pedro Artung, Alexis Nexis, DB Voaz, Jurídico Sem Gravata, Justiça e Cidadania, Firjan, Fiesp, Miguel Neto Advogados, Unicinos, IED, Fleischmann Hillard e The Future Society. Muito obrigado a todos.
Eu queria só fazer um agradecimento especial à Isabela, porque eu me lembro bem, a gente estava aqui ainda estudando o ano passado e estava tendo uma conversa de como essa universidade empodera os alunos, né, como ela lança os alunos a fazerem coisas grandiosas. E eu me lembro da Isabela pensando, poxa, eu queria fazer uma coisa que fosse grandiosa e que pudesse causar muito impacto no Brasil. Na época a gente estava envolvido na organização da Brasil Conference. Então ela disse, poxa, veja só, a Brasil Conference, a gente podia fazer um evento jurídico que fosse enorme. E existem bastantes barreiras, né? Vocês sabem disso, tanto daqui quanto de lá. Mas ela começou a pensar de maneira enorme, muito grande, e acho que aí com a ajuda de todos, o evento acabou sendo ainda maior daquilo que ela imaginava, e eu acho que o impacto pelas pessoas extremamente inteligentes que atenderam ao evento vai ser ainda maior do que ela estava pensando.
Então, eu queria agradecer mais uma vez a todo mundo, dizer que o que a gente quis proporcionar com esse evento foi um pouco da experiência de estar aqui também, né? Então, a gente teve aí uma semana intensa, super intensa, que é bem como a gente passa por aqui, né? A gente está sempre no limite, a gente conseguiu colocar vários tipos de palestras, vários tipos de assuntos, os temas mais novos, os temas do momento. Foi uma experiência ampla, a gente passou por salas diferentes da faculdade, a gente visitou lugares diferentes da faculdade, a gente passou pelo refeitório da faculdade, a gente quis proporcionar para todo mundo que veio, que acreditou na gente, um pouco dessa nossa experiência de passar por aqui, né? E de ter contato com pessoas tão diferentes, com ideias tão diferentes. A gente espera que vocês tenham realmente gostado. Eu queria agradecer a todo mundo que acreditou nessa ideia desde o início, desde quando era só uma ideia. Eu nunca ouvi dizer de nada semelhante a isso que a gente conseguiu fazer em uma semana. Nunca vi um evento desse tamanho, nunca vi um evento com tantos palestrantes, nunca vi uma delegação vindo de nenhum lugar do mundo do tamanho que veio essa. E se isso aconteceu foi porque desde o início a gente teve apoio importante de pessoas que confiaram na gente. Eu lembro quando eu conversei com o Pedro, a Alana foi a nossa primeira patrocinadora. Tinha que ter um diploma para o primeiro patrocinador, que é aquele que falava, vai acontecer, olha, dá para acontecer. E todo mundo que acreditou na gente todo esse tempo. Eu lembro que a gente, logo que essa nova turma, nós somos duas turmas aqui misturadas, logo que nós saímos, eles entraram, a gente já conversou, teve o apoio deles. E a gente fica muito feliz de ver que esse evento que nasce lá atrás, ele ganha a cara e o corpo de todo mundo, de todo o esforço que todo mundo fez para que a gente pudesse ter tido uma boa experiência. Então, eu queria agradecer muito a todos vocês e também a todos eles, a Luiz, a Bárbara, a todo mundo que ajudou, a Clara, que ajudou tanto a gente na segunda-feira, que era um dia de tanta preocupação, né? E é isso, e agradecer por ter dado tudo certo e por estar todo mundo tão feliz. Obrigada.
Eu não ia falar, mas enfim, o microfone veio para minha mão e eu vou aproveitar para agradecer a presença de todos vocês. Foi um prazer, uma honra conhecê-los e integrá-los aqui nesse nosso ambiente tão estimulante. Eu queria agradecer também a todos os membros da Brazilian Studies Association, a Débora, o Luiz, a Bárbara, a Clara, o Bruno e o Estevão, que fizeram um trabalho incrível nessa conferência. A Lilian e a Raíssa, que não estão aqui. Quem mais eu esqueci? Eu esqueci de alguém? João. Enfim, a gente sempre esquece de alguém. E a Isa e ao Eric, que, enfim, idealizaram esse evento e fizeram ele acontecer dessa forma maravilhosa. Então, agradeço a todos e espero que ano que vem a gente consiga novamente fazer um evento desse calibre, nessa ideia de os ex-alunos voltarem para, junto com os alunos do próximo ano, montarem esse evento tão bacana. Muito obrigada a todos.